Turn with me this morning to the 33rd chapter of the book of Genesis as we continue our study through the first book of the Bible. If you're not familiar with the Bible, that's okay. Genesis is the first book. It's pretty easy to find. The chapters are the large numbers on the page. The verses are the small numbers. You'll hear me reference those throughout the sermon, and that is there for us to help us navigate. Well, after fleeing his conniving father-in-law, whom he had served for 20 years, Jacob is finally on his way to Canaan. He's on his way home. But before he can return home, as we have seen, he must first face his brother Esau. Of course, Esau, as we know, had 20 years prior vowed to kill him for stealing the blessing from their father. And it was Esau's death threat, you remember, that had caused Jacob to flee 20 years prior. That is why Jacob was gone for 20 years. And as he prepares to face his brother, he is filled with all sorts of fear and anxiety. As we saw in chapter 32, he was afraid and greatly distressed. He fears that Esau is still angry with him. Stealing the blessing would have been life-altering for Esau. And certainly Jacob thought 20 years is not enough to assuage his anger. And so when Jacob received word from his servants that his brother was coming with 400 men, he is convinced that his life and the life of his family and everything he held dear was in jeopardy. So in an effort, you remember, to spare his family, he split them into two separate camps, and he put one over here and one over here, thinking that perhaps if I'm attacked, maybe at least one of these camps would survive and I could salvage something of my family. It's a terrible place for a man to be. But now all he can do is wait. He's between a rock and a hard place, as we often say. No amount of clever scheming can help him get out of this situation. So faced with certain disaster, you remember in chapter 32, Jacob did something we had never seen him do before. He prayed. And he prays these words in 32, beginning in verse 9. O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred, that I may do you good. I am not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become two camps. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him that he may come and attack me, the mothers with the children. But you said, I will surely do you good, and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. Jacob humbled himself before God. He recognized that everything that he had was the result of God's grace. He had deceived himself for many years into thinking that he was able to get what he wanted his way, and he had succeeded in that. But God had taught him a lesson in those 20 years with his father-in-law Laban. God had taught him a lesson through the scheming and deception of Laban. But here he confesses, I deserve none of the kindness that you've shown me. I don't deserve any of it. He said, I crossed this river on my way out of Canaan, and I had nothing. My pillow was a stone. And now I am returning after 20 years, and I have a family and all of these possessions. You have blessed me with the blessing you promised my father and my grandfather. And now, God, I pray that you will keep your promise and you will deliver me from my brother, lest he kill me and my family. And so following, you remember his prayer, Jacob prepares a sizable gift as a demonstration of his repentance. Jacob wasn't one of these people who says, well, I prayed, so let's let go and let God. No, he acted. He performed deeds in keeping with repentance. And he prepares this large gift of animals and flocks and herds and droves, and he sends them ahead with his servants to Esau. Though he cannot restore the blessing that he stole, he still seeks to make restitution. And so he sends them drove after drove, demonstrating his love for his brother and his desire to reconcile with him. And after seeing his servants off with the gift for his brother, Jacob moves his family into position, preparing them for what is to come the next morning, fearing the worst. And as the sun sets on Jacob, he once again is alone. But as was true in Bethel, he wouldn't be alone for long. Before he can settle in that night, a man lays his hand upon Jacob, and the two begin to wrestle. And they do so all night. And like we said last week, this wrestling match was similar to that of a father with a son, right? The father knows he could take his son down at any moment, but he only exerts enough energy to allow the fight to continue in an attempt to wear out the son. And that's what's going on here, this struggle between Jacob and this man whom we learn later in the text is none other than God himself. And you remember, as that struggle continues into the night, just before the sun rises, God reaches over and he just touches Jacob's hip and dislocates it and renders Jacob completely unable to continue the struggle. And though he is unable, you remember, to continue the fight, Jacob still refuses to let go, and he pleads with God. He says, God, I will not let you go until you bless me. And it is in response to this request for blessing that the Lord changes his name. You will no longer be Jacob, the deceiver. You will be called Israel, for you have striven with God and prevailed. How did Jacob prevail? He didn't beat God. He didn't pin God to the ground. In fact, it looks like he lost the match. So how did he prevail? Well, he prevailed in that he got what he asked for, because following that, the Lord blessed him. And he taught Jacob an important lesson. And that lesson is this: you will not receive the blessing of God by your own strength. You cannot receive the blessing of God. Jacob, you might have gotten all of these other things, and you might have been able to attribute much of what you have accomplished in your life to your own scheming and to your own deceit, but you will not receive the blessing of God that way. Jacob has finally been humbled. His source of strength has been dislocated. He has been emptied of self-reliance. And this is where we find him in our text this morning. Look with me at Genesis chapter 33 and just follow along with me as I read this morning. This is the word of the Lord. And Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau was coming, and 400 men with him. So he divided the children among Leah and Rachel, and the two female servants, and he put the servants with their children in front, then Leah with her children, and Rachel and Joseph last of all. He himself went on before them, bowing himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. But Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. And when Esau lifted up his eyes and saw the women and children, he said, "Who are these with you?" And Jacob said, "The children whom God has graciously given your servant." Then the servants drew near, they and their children, and bowed down. Leah likewise and her children drew near and bowed down, and last Joseph and Rachel drew near, and they bowed down. Esau said, "What do you mean by all this company that I met?" Jacob answered, "To find favor in the sight of my Lord." But Esau said, "I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." Jacob said, "No, please, if I have found favor in your sight, then accept my present from my hand. For I have seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God, and you have accepted me. Please accept my blessing that is brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me, and because I have enough." Thus he urged him, and he took it. Then Esau said, "Let us journey on our way, and I will go ahead of you." But Jacob said to him, "My Lord knows that the children are frail, and that the nursing flocks and herds are a care to me. If they are driven hard for one day, all the flocks will die. Let my Lord pass on ahead of his servant, and I will lead on slowly at the pace of the livestock that are ahead of me, and at the pace of the children, until I come to my lord and Seir." So Esau said, "Let me leave with you some of the people who are with me." But he said, "What need is there? Let me find favor in the sight of my lord." So Esau returned that day on his way to Seir. But Jacob journeyed to Succoth, and built himself a house and made booths for his livestock. Therefore the name of the place is called Succoth. And Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, on his way to Paddan Aram, and he camped before the city. And from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, he bought for 100 pieces of money the piece of land on which he had pitched his tent. There he erected an altar and called it El Elohi Israel. And this is the word of the Lord. As the sun rose on that morning, following his wrestling match with God, Jacob emerged a new man. He is no longer Jacob, the self-sufficient deceiver. He is now Israel, the man who strove with God. He has received that for which he had longed for, the blessing of God. And again, as we saw last week, he did not obtain the blessing of God through his own strength, as though he could wrestle it from God. No, he obtained it by faith, you remember. He obtained it by faith as he surrendered himself to the Lord. And in that, he learned that the all-important lesson that we see throughout the Scriptures, that it is in our weakness, not in our strength, that God's power is made perfect in us. So now, having been humbled, Jacob is finally ready to meet his brother. And as he goes out to meet Esau, he doesn't go out with his head held high. He doesn't go out with an air of confidence. But you remember how he goes to his brother? He goes with a limp. He's limping. He's not a strong man. He's in a weaker position than he was before. And that limp, of course, is a constant reminder of God's dislocation of Jacob's strength. That physical dislocation of the hip, the strength of the wrestler. Right? You can't wrestle when your hip is out of socket. And that was a reminder to Jacob that just as I have dislocated your physical strength, which led you to surrender to me physically, I have dislocated your source of strength spiritually and made you dependent upon me, and now you are ready for use. We see this new day unfolding. Notice in verse 1, we read that Jacob arose and he lifted up his eyes, and he saw that Esau was coming and 400 men with him. You know, it's important to recognize here that though Jacob had prayed, though he had sent the servants to meet his brother with this lavish gift, and though he had wrestled with God all night and prevailed, do you notice here that his circumstances have not changed? Esau is still coming, and 400 men are still with him. You know, often we find ourselves in a situation like Jacob, a situation that is beyond our control. And so what do? We are quick to enter the ring with God, and so we are quick to wrestle with Him, and we strive with Him. And maybe we strive all night as Jacob did. Maybe you've had those kinds of nights in your own life, and you are striving with God, and you are wrestling with God, and you are fighting with God. Why? To negotiate better circumstances, of course. We've all been there, haven't we? God, if you will just get me out of this situation, everything would be better. I could serve you better. I could honor you better. Just get me out of this circumstance. Get me out of this job. It's driving me crazy. Get me out of this marriage. It's a mess. But here's the thing. Removing us from our circumstances is seldom God's will. Though Jacob may have wrestled with God in an effort to change his circumstances, God had wrestled with Jacob. You remember, as Derek Kidner said in his commentary, God was wrestling with Jacob in order to change his heart. Jacob wrestled with God for a change of circumstances. God wrestled with Jacob for a change of heart. You see, if God had changed Jacob's circumstances, but his heart had remained unchanged, Jacob would be no better for it. He would have remained the same proud, self-reliant schemer he had always been. I mean, Jacob had always been a master manipulator of his circumstances. But this time, God had him pinned down. And as helpless as Jacob felt in that moment, it would prove to be the pivotal moment of his life. Have you had a moment like that in your life? Where God pinned you to the ground, and you would rather be anywhere but that place. But now as you look back, as you limped away from that moment, you look back and now you see that that is the place where God did His work, His greatest work in your life. You see, it is only when we have surrendered to God's will in the midst of our circumstances that we are able, as Paul said, to learn the secret of contentment. What's the secret of contentment? Whether in lack or whether in plenty, I can do what? All things through Him who gives me strength. It says Elizabeth Elliot, you remember the famous missionary Elizabeth Elliot, she once said in her book, Keep My Heart, the secret is Christ in me, not me in a different set of circumstances. The secret is Christ in me, not me in a different set of circumstances. You see, though we may claim to believe that God is sovereign over all things, we often act as though our circumstances, particularly our difficult circumstances, have come upon us by sheer coincidence. As if they are somehow outside the will of God, and certainly God has made a mistake here, and He needs to extricate me from the situation. Friends, nothing could be further from the truth. As we see in the life of Jacob here, our circumstances are often the means by which God works in our hearts to cultivate a deeper trust in Him. I've been there, and I know many of you have been there. And if you haven't been there, you can be assured that God is going to take you there. Think about the circumstances of your life. Think about Jacob's circumstances. Think about his fear of his brother. This is a situation he could not get out of. He could not fight off his brother. But it proved to be an opportunity to turn Jacob's heart away from himself, away from self-reliance, and toward a God dependence. And friends, that's what God is doing in our life. And it's not a fun work, it's a painful work that God does in us. When you think about the circumstances of your life, maybe you find yourself in a situation at the moment that you want to get away from, you want to escape. You are praying, God, get me out of this situation. Maybe you are in the ring with God at the moment, right now. And maybe you're thinking, you know what, prevailing with God here would mean a change of circumstance. But what if prevailing with God does not mean changed circumstances? What if prevailing with God here, like Jacob, means a change of heart? What if prevailing with God means that He gives you the grace to face those circumstances in faith so that you might be conformed to the image of His Son, because that is the ultimate goal, that you would look more like Jesus. God is less concerned with our happiness, our health, and our wealth than He is our holiness. If you are healthy, wealthy, and well, and you die that way, but you don't look like Jesus, what is your life? Instead of saying, get me out of this, maybe what we should be saying is, not my will, but your will be done. Just like Christ. Heard that this morning in the Gospel of John. I came not to do my will, but the will of my Father. If that is the path of Jesus, then we who are His children, who are to be conformed to His image, should expect to walk the same road. We see evidence of the change in Jacob's heart in what takes place next in verse 3. When after dividing up his family, we read here that it is he who went on before them, Prior, he was sending messengers ahead. He was putting his family ahead. But now it's him. He is leading. He is running out before everyone to go and to meet his brother. Because as a changed man, he can now meet his circumstances head on. Recognizing that it is not up to him. The outcome is not his to orchestrate. It is God's. Jacob's humility and brokenness is further demonstrated here by the manner in which he approaches his brother. Look at what happens. He goes and it says he was bowing himself to the ground 7 times. And of course, 7 in the Bible is the number of completion. It emphasizes just the sheer humility of Jacob in this moment. He bowed himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. You see, after having encountered God, the old Jacob, as we said earlier, would no doubt have approached his brother with his head high. You remember when he left Bethel? So at Bethel, he meets the Lord at Bethel. And how did he leave Bethel? He left Bethel with his head held high, running off to Paddan Aram. He was so excited. He was on a mission. He knew he could do this. He was not a broken man. He was a confident man. And this encounter with God, however, had changed him. You see, when one has truly been face to face with God, as Jacob said, I remember what he said last week, I have been face to face with God and lived. When you've had that kind of encounter with God, the kind that Jacob had at Penuel, you can no longer be confident in yourself. Instead, you see yourself as desperately in need of God's grace. The prophet Isaiah, you remember, had an experience like this, and it's recorded in the 6th chapter of Isaiah. Isaiah was the holy man. He was the prophet of Israel. He was the guy who was multiple tiers above the people, the sinners, the rebels, the ones who were getting themselves into trouble with God. And you remember in that moment, the year that King Uzziah died, it says that Isaiah looked into the heavens and he saw the Lord there, and he saw the throne room and the Lord seated on his throne. And you remember what happened? When he saw this, he cried out, "Woe is me." I think it's the King James. "Woe is me, for I am undone. I am ruined." And then he says this, "For I am a man of unclean lips, and I live in the midst of a people with unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King of the Lord of hosts." In other words, he said, when I saw myself in relationship to God, I realized there is actually no difference between me and everyone else. I am a man of unclean lips, and I live in the midst of a people with unclean lips. The Lord is holy. He is not like me. And when we have an encounter with God like that, it shifts all of our priorities. It shifts all of our relationships. It has to. It provides us with a proper perspective of ourselves, of others, and God. You notice that before his encounter with God, Jacob's concern was ordered in this way. It was self first, others second, and God last of all, if at all. But now, notice, his concern is God first, others second, and himself last. His fear of his brother had been replaced with a proper fear of God, and that allowed him to approach his brother in genuine humility, acknowledging that he was not worthy of his brother's favor. This word favor is interesting. It's used 4 times here in this story, and that's 1/3 of the times that we see it appear in the book of Genesis. And the word favor there is simply the same word we would use in the New Testament. It's the word grace. And friends, that is the surest sign that you have had a true encounter with God. It's that you recognize your need for grace and you recognize your responsibility to give it. That is a sure sign that you belong to Him. That you recognize that you are in desperate need of grace and that you have a responsibility to give it to others. If you withhold grace, if you withhold forgiveness, that calls into question who it is you truly belong to. Jesus said that. The parable of the unforgiving servant. How many times, if you do not forgive, it will not be forgiven you. We are not saved because we forgive others. But if we are saved, we will forgive others. We will show grace. Jacob's submission, interestingly, raises a question for us, however. You remember the promise of God made back in chapter 25. In your womb are two nations, two twins, two boys. And the older will serve the younger. And then the promise, of course, of Isaac and the blessing is that Jacob would be the one to whom others would bow. But here, it is Jacob who is bowing down. Jacob is the one who is prostrating himself before his brother. This seems like a reversal of the promise. What is going on here? Jacob's actions don't seem to make much sense in light of what God has promised. So does Jacob's prostrating himself before his brother represent a failure of God's word? Certainly not. What we see here is a principle found throughout the Scriptures, a principle that stands at the very heart of God's economy. The path to exaltation is humiliation. You see, until Jacob was emptied of himself, he could not become Israel. Until Jacob was humbled and empty, he could not become Israel. A.W. Tozer writes this. Listen to what he says. It is doubtful whether God can bless man. It is doubtful whether God can bless a man greatly until he has hurt him deeply. God actually rises up storms of conflict in relationships at times in order to accomplish that deeper work in our character. We cannot love our enemies in our own strength. This is graduate level grace. Are you willing to enter this school? Are you willing to take that test? If you pass, you can expect to be elevated to a new level in the kingdom. For He brings us through these tests as preparation for greater use in the kingdom. You must first pass the test. You see, friends, that exaltation comes by way of humility, stands at the very center and heart of the gospel. Just as Jacob was the one to whom others were to bow, and yet he submitted himself to his brother, so too there was another who would come after him many, many years later. And he was the one to whom the whole world would bow. He is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, the one who is worthy of worship. But what does he do? He humbled himself. He did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he made himself nothing. He humbled himself. He came in the likeness of sinful flesh, and he was obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross for us. Jacob did not hold his superiority over his brother as an instrument to oppress his brother. He laid it down as an opportunity to reconcile with his brothers. And that is what the Lord has done for us. He laid aside his glory. That's what Philippians 2 is talking about. That passage is called the kenosis passage. The word kenosis comes from the Greek, which means emptying. He emptied himself. He came to this earth. He lived among us as one of us, as in the likeness of sinful flesh. Though he had no sin, he looked like us. He experienced the suffering and the pain and the heartache of living in a sin-broken world, yet he was perfectly obedient to his Father at every turn. At every turn. He did what Adam was supposed to do and wouldn't do and couldn't do. He did what we were supposed to do and couldn't do and wouldn't do. Adam is in a garden of a million yeses in paradise, and he can't obey one command. Jesus is driven into the wilderness where he has nothing, and what does he do? When the temptation for food comes to him, while he's starving after 40 days, he obeys the will of his Father. And the Bible says that not only was he obedient to the will of his Father in that temptation and throughout his life, but he was obedient, as Paul says, to the point of death, even death on a cross, because on that cross, he was taking our sin upon himself. He took every evil deed that we have ever done, every evil thought that we have ever thought, all of our sin was placed upon Jesus, and in that moment, as he hung upon that cross, the Father poured out his judgment and punishment upon Jesus. The punishment that we deserved fell upon him. He paid for my sins. He paid for your sins. That's what it means when it says, when we use it becomes cliche in the church when we say the words, Jesus died for your sins. Do you understand what that means? Every sin that you ever committed, every sin that has broken fellowship, that very thing that is the greatest obstacle between you and God, He has taken care of it. And the Bible says that 3 days later, He was laid in a grave. 3 days later, He rose again. And because He rose, we can have life. You see, His resurrection proves that the sins He died for were not His. If they were His sins, He'd still be in the grave. But they were not His sins. And thus, He rose from the grave, proving that the sins for which He died were not His, they were ours. And the Bible makes this promise to you, friends, that if you will turn from your sin and turn to Christ, and this is not two actions, it's one. If I'm walking towards my sin and embracing my sin, as I turn to Christ, I am, by definition, no longer embracing my sins, I am embracing Christ. And if you will put your faith and your trust in Him, not trusting in your own good works, not trusting in your efforts, not trusting in your religion, not trusting in anything other than what Jesus has done for you through His perfect life, His sin-bearing death, and His life-giving resurrection, the Bible says that God will do this for you. He will make a trade, the greatest trade of all. That perfect life that was required of you, that you and I could not live, God will take the perfect life of Jesus and He will credit it to your account as though you lived it. So that when He looks upon you, He no longer sees you the sinner. He sees you the righteous. Because you're clothed in the righteousness of Jesus. And then the penalty that has been hanging over your head for your sin, Jesus says it's paid for. Jesus paid for it on the cross. And then, as if that was not enough, He then gives you resurrection life so that you can now walk in the newness of life. You can be changed and transformed and walk in this new life that God has given to you. And you have the promise of eternal life, that you will never die. Certainly this corruptible, perishable body with its indwelling sin must die. But that's simply laying aside this tent for a time until the day of resurrection, when we get our glorified bodies. And God makes everything wrong right again. And friend, if you're here this morning and you've not put your faith and your trust in Him, I implore you, do it today. The writer of Hebrews says today is the day of salvation, not tomorrow. As long as He gives you breath, you can trust Him. As long as He gives you breath, you can be reconciled to Him. Some of you in this room have lost friends or family members, and those relationships were not reconciled at the time of death. It's painful. You can't reconcile with someone after death. And friends, you cannot be reconciled with God after death. You cannot. The time for reconciliation, the time of salvation is now. Put your trust in Him. And Christian, think about this truth as well for yourself. And the writer of Hebrews tells us that Jesus is the author and the perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before Him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Humiliation to exaltation. What does it mean that He is the author and perfecter? That word author is the same word that we get the word pioneer from. It means that He's the trailblazer. He went out before us. He cleared the path. And now He beckons us, come, follow me. Deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. And friends, if you're a child of God, recognize what this means. This means that our road is the Calvary road. We cannot expect that the road we are called to walk is different than the one He walked. He has blazed the trail, and we must follow after Him. That means if we wish to be exalted, we too must be willing to humble ourselves before God and before others. I mean, that's at the center of what it means to be a Christian. Like Rick said in the parenting conference, he taught his children, there's only 4 words you really need to know as a Christian. And 2 of them are the same. Remember what they were? Love God, love others. All of the law and the prophets are summed up in that statement, Jesus said. Our problem is ultimately a love problem. We love ourselves. We love ourselves more than others. And we love the things that God gives us more than we love Him. But God does a work in our hearts through Christ and by His Spirit and through His Word to change those affections, to reorder, as it were, those affections, so that we might love Him rightly and love others truly. And that's what sets us apart. That's why Jesus told His disciples, they will know you are Christians by your what? Your love. Your love for one another. Not because you show up every Sunday morning at 9 a.m. for a church service, although that is important. Not because you do good deeds. Not because you're nice. As we're going to see, Esau turns out to be a pretty nice guy. But nice doesn't get you to heaven. It didn't get Esau there. It's all of grace. And those who have experienced the grace of God will be changed and transformed. They will be self-sacrificial people. They will be long-suffering people. They will be forgiving people. They will be repenting people. Speaking of Esau's response, notice in verse 4, it's completely unexpected that as you're reading the story and if you don't know the outcome, you're coming to the climax here. Oh man, what's going to happen? Verse 4. But Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. Notice the succession of words. Ran, embraced, fell, kissed, wept. That it's like a machine gun, as it were. Staccato of these words that just demonstrates it's almost as though 20 years of emotion has just unloaded itself. In fact, the language here is the same exact language that Jesus used. Remember, Jesus is a Jew. He knew the Old Testament well. He knew this story well. And He used this same language in one of His parables. Can you remember which one it was? The story of the prodigal son. Remember what the father did when the son came home? Remember that? He ran, he embraced, he fell on his neck, and he kissed him, and he wept. Jesus borrowed the same language in His parable. It denotes here excessive joy on the part of Esau. And we learn here that it was not only Jacob's heart that had been changed, but Esau's had been changed too. But what was it that led to Esau's change of heart? I mean, was it merely the passing of time, right? They say time heals all wounds, but we know that's not true. We all know people who haven't spoken to someone in over 20 years. So time doesn't heal all wounds. Maybe it was just Esau's good-natured personality. I don't know too many good-natured people who threaten to kill people, particularly their own family. Some have tried to argue that point. Nothing is really revealed here about the nature or about Esau's thoughts and the process here of what has happened. But here's something we can be assured of. We can be sure that the same God who was at work in Jacob was also at work in Esau. Do you understand that truth? God is at work in every person. He is sovereign over all things, so there is nothing in which His fingerprints are not found. He's everywhere. So the same God that is at work, and remember that when you're in conflict with someone. It's not like God is only doing a work in your heart. He's doing a work in the heart of the other person. Remember that. And you can help that work. You can facilitate that work by demonstrating grace and love and repentance, as Jacob does here. I like what A.W. Pink writes. He has a great little book. I think it's even public domain. You can find it online. It's called Gleanings in Genesis, and it's just a great little devotional type book. But I love what he says here. Listen to this. He says, personally, we have no doubt that had Esau been left to himself, his reception of his erring brother would have been very different from what it was. But he was not left to himself. Jacob had prayed earnestly to God and had pleaded His promise. So Jacob had been praying for Esau. So there's an expectation that if I'm praying for you, God is working in you. He continues, and now He, in whose hands is the king's heart, and who turns it wherever He will, Proverbs 21. And He inclined the fierce and envious heart of Esau to deal kindly with Jacob. And he fell on his neck, and he kissed him. Friends, though we may not be able to change our circumstances, one thing we can remember is that God can work through our circumstances in unexpected ways when we go to Him in prayer. But we so neglect prayer. One of the greatest evidences that we neglect prayer is that 1/10 of you will be back here Wednesday night for prayer. 1/10. And I don't say that to guilt people, but it does make me wonder about priorities in our life. Do you pray at home? Do you spend time? And I don't mean, just a little prayer here and there, but I mean, do you talk to God? Do you plead with God the way that Jacob pled with God? Do you do that? Do you confess your unworthiness before Him and recognize that He is, you have nothing apart from Him, and that everything that you have comes from Him? Do you claim His promises in prayer? God, you told me that you were going to lead me back to this land. You told me that you were going to make my offspring as numerable as the sands of the sea. I'm claiming that promise, God. You gave me that promise, and I trust that you will fulfill it. Does that reflect your prayer life? It's interesting that when Jacob prayed, he asked God to deliver him from the hand of his brother. God answered his prayer, but He didn't answer his prayer by doing to Esau what He had done to Pharaoh in the case of Abraham, right? By sending plagues upon his household. He didn't do to Esau what he did to Abimelech, coming to him in a night terror, scaring the daylights out of him and saying, if you lay a hand on this guy, I'm going to kill you. No, what does he do? He changes his heart. He turns his anger, his brother's anger, a heart of anger, into a heart of affection for his brother. Matthew Henry writes, God had the hearts of all men in His hands and can turn them when and how He pleases. By a secret, silent, but resistless power, He can, of a sudden, convert enemies into friends. Friends, that gives us great hope for reconciliation in every broken relationship. In verse 5, Esau inquires of Jacob, who are these with you? Jacob responds, of course, by introducing his servants, his wives, and his children. He says, but look at what he says, verse 5, the children whom God has graciously given your servant. I love that. He's quick to identify God as the source of all that he has. This is where we're seeing the change in his heart. These are not merely Jacob's children. No, they are a gracious gift of God to him. Verse 8, Esau asks Jacob about the gift. What do you mean by all this company that I met? Esau's words here demonstrate how much God has changed his heart towards his brother. He was so filled with affection for his brother, it almost seems like he forgot the offense. He can't understand, why would you be giving me a gift? So Jacob explains. He says, to find favor, to find grace in the sight of my Lord. Of course, Esau downplays the gift. He says, I have enough. Look, I have enough, my brother. Keep it for yourself. It's okay. Esau had prospered greatly over these 20 years. But Jacob, of course, insists in verse 10. No, he says, please, I have found favor. If I have found favor in your sight, then accept my present from my hand. I love this. For I have seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God, and you have accepted me. That's interesting because it means here, in a sense, that the two most important pivotal events in Jacob's life happened within 24 hours of each other. He saw the face of God, and then he saw the face of God in his brother. Think about that. He had seen the face of God and lived, and now he had seen the face of God in his brother and again lived. What a testament to the grace of God. The proof that Jacob had been forgiven and accepted by God was that he had seen his face and lived, back in chapter 32. And likewise, the proof that Jacob had been forgiven and accepted by his brother is that he had seen his face and lived. And herein, friends, we see another gospel truth. And that truth is this: reconciliation with our brother is the fruit of reconciliation with God. This stands at the very heart of the gospel. In the garden, what happened? We had fellowship with God. Adam and Eve fellowship with one another. It was a beautiful picture. Everything was perfect. And what happens? They sin against God, and now suddenly they recognize that they are naked and ashamed. The vertical relationship was broken, and now the horizontal relationship is broken. And so now we are not only at enmity with God, we are at enmity with one another, because we have now declared ourselves to be our own gods. And so we fight, as James says, and we war with one another because we don't get what we want. We don't get the recognition we want. We don't get the possessions we want. So we fight and we war with one another. And it's been that way from the beginning of time. We just saw that a week and a half ago in Israel. What's going on over there is an overflow of what we see in the garden and what we see all throughout the Scriptures. We see that, and it's heinous, and we think that somehow we are different than those people. We're not. The seeds of our sin may not have come into full bloom, as we see in the terrorists in Israel and Hamas, but those seeds are still there. You see, again, we have a love problem. We don't love God. We don't love one another. That's why Jesus said when he was asked, what is the greatest commandment? The young man was asking, which of the 10 commandments is the greatest one? I want to know, priority-wise, which is the most important? And Jesus says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. We see that principle in the 10 commandments, the first 4 commandments in the Decalogue. Speak of our relationship with God. Love the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me, no graven images. Don't use my name in vain, and honor my day. The last 6 commandments are all horizontal. Honor your father and mother. Don't steal from each other. Don't commit adultery. Don't covet what your neighbor has. The law reveals the brokenness of our hearts, that we don't love God as we should, and we don't love our neighbor as we should. And so God has come to change that. And when you have been transformed by the gospel of Jesus Christ, when He has taken that old heart of stone and put in a new heart, when He has transformed you and changed you, one of the clearest evidences of this reality in your life is going to be forgiveness and a desire for reconciliation with your brother. St. Clement once said this: for the sake of each of us, He laid down His life, worth no less than the universe. He demands of us in return our lives for the sake of each other. Think about that. Listen to that again. For the sake of each of us, He laid down His life, and His life was worth no less than the whole universe. Therefore, He demands of us in return our lives for the sake of each other. Is there someone in your life whom you can't forgive? Is there someone in your life with whom you are not reconciled? Is there an Esau? Maybe you fear that person. Maybe you fear what they would do to you, what they would say about you, or that they would reject you. But that's not up to us. We're not called to fear man, we're called to fear God. And we're called to obey God. William Gurnall, the great Puritan, said that when I find myself overwhelmed with the fear of man, I turn my eyes to the fear of God, and that remedies all other fears. And so I can go in obedience, I can go in humility, and I can go in repentance, and I can seek reconciliation with my brother. As hard as it might be. And again, the results are not up to you, friend. That's why Paul says in Romans chapter 12, he says, as much as it depends upon you, live peaceably with all men. Not everyone will live peaceably with you, but have you done your part in seeking to live peaceably with them? You don't know what God might do. After Jacob's urging, of course, Esau finally does accept that gift, and then he urges him to follow him back to his home in the land of Seir. But in verse 14, we see that Jacob hesitates at this offer, and he explains that he has to travel slow because of his children and the herds and the flocks and so on. And he says, go ahead, I'll meet you there. And Esau responds again by offering to leave some of his people with Jacob to help him in the journey. But again, Jacob refuses. And this is an odd interaction here, right? It's kind of like, it seems like, at least some have suspected, Jacob is being deceptive again, because Jacob ends up not going to Seir. He ends up going back to Canaan. So what's going on here? Is he lying to his brother? Is this fearful, self-sufficient Jacob again? Dr. James Hartley writes this. He said, this interaction is perhaps best understood as a polite refusal of Esau's offer, with both brothers realizing that Jacob would never make it to Seir. It's kind of like that. You ever had that? Hey, we should do lunch sometime. And both of you know full well you're not going to do lunch sometime. Right? Or I'll see you later. Right? And you know you're probably not going to see them later. So it may be best understood to look at this way. But either way, what's going on here is that what Jacob is doing is ultimately right, because he is the heir to the covenant, the promise. He is called to peace with his brother, but he is not called to peace with his brother at the expense of obedience to God. He has a call to go back to Canaan, back to Bethel. That's where he is to be. And he is to be separate from his brother. He is to be separate from the surrounding nations. He is to be set apart. The last thing that Jacob needs is to go into Seir with his brother, intermingle with his brother, and end up tied up in a situation perhaps like he had been with Laban, or grow comfortable in a land outside of Canaan which God had forbidden him. And the call of God upon his life was to go home to Canaan, to the land of your fathers. Keep your vow. Go back to Bethel. And so Esau returns to Seir, and Jacob heads back to Canaan. But there's a tragedy in the mix. We'll see it more next week. And there's such a lesson to be learned here. Jacob leaves and he goes back towards Canaan, but he stops short. And he spends time in Succoth, which literally means booths. And he builds himself a house, builds some shelters. And apparently he lives there, we can assess potentially as long as 9 years, because of the age of his daughter Dinah, who comes into play in the next chapter. He leaves Succoth and then he goes back into the land, but he doesn't go to Bethel as he had vowed he would do. He goes to Shechem. And that will prove to be a fateful decision, a tragic decision that proves to be partial obedience. And friends, partial obedience is ultimately disobedience. God's going to call Jacob later, chapter 35. He's going to say, get up and go to Bethel. But what takes place between chapter 33 and 34 will devastate this family and will reverberate long into the future. Friends, partial obedience is not what God calls us to. Because partial obedience assumes that we know what's best, not God. That God wants me to go this far, but I think I can go this far. Yeah, I mean, Shechem and Bethel were only about a day's journey apart. They weren't that far. But he settled there in Shechem among the Canaanites, and he buys land from them, and it appears that a relationship develops of some sort. And sadly, he appears to have made some sort of peace with these people. And the consequences will haunt this family. Friends, God desires nothing more and commands nothing more than complete and total surrender of our will and our desires. Not to keep back something for ourselves. We saw how that went in Acts chapter 5 with Ananias and Sapphira. And the same holds true for us today. What is it that you're holding back? Maybe you're only willing to go so far. Okay, I can't go any further than this. I know God says go here, but I can only do that. Fathers, maybe that's you. Maybe you're in a situation where you know what God has called you to do. You know what obedience looks like, but you're only willing to go this far because maybe you don't want to look stupid. Or maybe you have fear. Maybe you're afraid to lead because you don't know what leading looks like, and so you only go so far. Maybe you're a wife here this morning and you see what the Scripture says, submit to your husbands and everything as unto the Lord, but you're like, you know what? I don't trust this guy. He makes kind of bad decisions on occasion and gets us in a pickle. But again, God puts you in these circumstances, and He calls you to obey. That's why Paul says submit in everything, not some things. When you can't trust your husband, trust God for your husband. Just like Jacob, when he couldn't trust Esau, he trusted God for Esau. What is it? What is that line that keeps you from full obedience? Friends, the consequences of partial obedience are always tragic, just as the consequences for disobedience are tragic. And we'll see that next week, chapter 34. We're going to close, and I want to let the guys know, I would like to sing Surrender All as our closing song instead of the one we picked. I think that song we sang before the sermon is very fitting, so we'll sing that. And I would encourage you this morning, as you close with that song this morning, that you offer that up as a prayer to the Lord. Surrender all. Can you say those words? I surrender all.